Well,
If you want, I can get that mic.
Oh,
You don't need this one, right?
no thanks. Okay. Good to see you guys. Thank you for having me. Gibson reached out to me, and I was very excited and grateful for the invitation. Just a little bit about myself. I got married in 2018. And I have two wonderful kids, a 3-year-old and a 1.5-year-old. So any of you who have kids, you know my pain right now. Don't get a lot of sleep, but we're making do. A little history about myself. As Tim said, I'm second generation Filipino American. My dad immigrated here to find work. He first started in the cold winter of Minnesota, was shocked by the winter, and then went to sunny Southern California. He found work, and the company was willing to sponsor him to become a citizen here. And then he sent for my mother and my older siblings to come over, and they all became citizens here. And then I was born in Pasadena, California, raised in LA County, and actually graduated from Troy High School in the early 2000s. So if you grew up in the neighborhood, I was right down the street for you many years ago. So many Filipinos are Catholic because the Philippines is a Catholic nation, but I am not. My family is not, actually. The story goes is that my great-grandfather in the Philippines encountered a Protestant missionary, and that's when he converted. So he raised his family in the Protestant tradition, and then when my grandfather had his own family, he did the same. And then obviously my father, when he had his family, raised us in the Protestant tradition. Growing up, I really thought nothing of it. I just lived my life. I didn't think about it at all. But if I took a step back, I realized that I'm a 4th generation in a line of Protestant believers, people who follow the Protestant tradition. And another way of saying that is my religion is the product of the experiences of my great-grandfather. What was passed down from my great-grandfather, I think, in general, is a positive thing. I'm glad to be Protestant. But just as much as good things can be passed down from generation to generation, negative things can be passed down as well. So when bad things are passed down from generation to generation, this is called generational trauma, or you may also see it as intergenerational trauma. So I want to get into some definitions on this next slide. So let's define it. Generational trauma is passing down of traumatic experiences or the symptoms of traumatic experiences from one generation to another. Now, a traumatic experience is when we experience something highly stressful, say for instance like a time of war, or it could be something lower in stress for a longer period of time. That is sometimes, the events are sometimes out of our control, but always difficult to cope or deal with. So that level of stress, whether it's high in one instance, like a car crash where you may have almost died, or a lower stress over a long period of time, it was a difficulty of dealing with it. So one example for me is when I was a child, I stuck a metal key into an electric socket, thinking that there would be treasures inside. Yeah, they're in my mind. Embarrassingly enough, I did it twice on 2 different occasions. Luckily, my parents were around to kick me off, but I could have died very easily. So that was my traumatic experience. And to this day, I get a lot of stress and anxiety around static electricity or getting electrical shock. So you'll never find me in the winter with a wool sweater. It makes me cringe. A lower stress example would be, say for instance, parents having a prolonged high expectation on their children to to have straight A's in school. Although it's typically not a life-threatening situation, hopefully, a life or death situation, hopefully that's not the case. If a child is unable to cope or deal with the stress, it could turn into, over time, maybe some type of depression or anxiety because they're not able to meet their parents' expectations. The areas in which the symptoms of traumatic experiences express itself on this next slide in what we therapists call a biopsychosocial spiritual realm. So, which means it could show in kind of these 4 areas. First, biologically, you could think of like brain chemistry, say for instance, chemical imbalances in your brain that can prevent us from managing our emotions well. Or we could even think of it as physical impairments, like sore muscles or tightness in breathing, unable to breathe. Another way it shows up is psychologically. We think of behaviors such as being defiant or being overcome with depression or anxiety that's disruptive in your everyday life. It could show up socially, for instance, having trouble maintaining friendships or having the need to be with friends all the time just so you don't feel lonely. And it could also happen spiritually, like only being able to see God as a punishing boss and not a loving father. So we're dealing with 2 ways generational trauma is passed down. One is through a traumatic experience that is being repeated throughout the generations. And then the other is the symptoms of these experiences being passed down. An example of traumatic experience being passed down from generation to generation is child abuse. 30% of abused children become abusers themselves, and abused children are 6 times more likely to be abusers of their children. So the article I read, clearly there's many factors that contribute to this behavior, but abuse is commonly passed down often because the abusers and the children of abusers do not grow up with the tools to deal with their own emotions. They take it out on the people around them. Now, an example of the symptoms of traumatic experiences being passed down come from a book I read called It Didn't Start With You by Mark Wolin. It shares a study about a group of pregnant women who survived or were around the situation of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Experiencing 9/11 caused major stress in these pregnant women, many of which were diagnosed with PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. The women who were in their 2nd or 3rd trimester of pregnancy, across the board, the babies were smaller than average, and they also had lower levels of cortisol in their brain. Now, cortisol is a hormone in the brain that it secretes in the brain that does many things, one of which is to manage emotions. So these children, they grew up with low levels of cortisol, struggling to manage their emotions and their stress levels. An impairment like this over time leads to psychological disorders like depression or anxiety or bipolar disorder, things like that. Now, I want you to take a moment and think. You don't have to speak out loud, just kind of scan your history. Are there experiences that you or your family have gone through that might have been traumatic, that might have been passed down from generation to generation? And we'll get into that more in a little bit. Now that we have a better idea of what generational trauma is, I wanted for us to have a common foundation, biblical foundation, to help our understanding. So our first example comes from the scripture in Exodus, the next slide. Thank you. Exodus chapter 34, verse 6 through 7. The Lord passed in front of him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God who is compassionate and merciful, very patient, full of great loyalty and faithfulness, showing great loyalty to 1,000 generations, forgiving every kind of sin and rebellion, yet by no means clearing the guilty, punishing for their parents' sins, their children and their grandchildren, as well as the third and fourth generation. Now, the context of this passage is when the Israelites had sinned and broken their covenant with God. God was convinced that, since they turned away from him, that they were too far gone, and even the future generations must be punished. The greater section of this scripture was meant to illustrate to the readers that God was a good God, and for him to be a good God, God had to deliver justice to evil. Here we see God recognizing that the consequences of sin can ripple and affect future generations. The sin of abuse, the sin of greed, the sin of turning away from God can have a generational impact. Now, at the time, Moses in that passage was up in the mountains trying to convince God to spare the Israelites. Somehow, luckily, he managed and reminded God of his covenant agreement with the Israelites. So God decided to spare them. Now, let's look in the second passage from Ezekiel on the next slide. Chapter 18, verse 14, and then 17 through 18. But suppose he has a child who sees all the sins of his father has committed. He becomes alarmed and doesn't do them. He refrains from oppressing the poor by taking neither interest nor profit. He observes my case laws and follows my regulations. He will die because of his father's guilt. He will surely live. As for the father, he exploited the weak and committed robbery, or did anything else that wasn't good for the people. He will die because of his own guilt. Now, at first, the passage from Ezekiel seems completely contradictory to the passage in Exodus. However, it is at this point that God brings his hope apart from the hopeless nature of sin. In Exodus, God explains the consequences of sin and how it's intergenerational. And here in Ezekiel, the hope of God is that we can be moved to break that cycle of sin. When we take it even further, we see God's plan of hope fulfilled through Jesus in John chapter 9, verses 1 through 3. In the next slide, as Jesus walked along, he saw a man who was blind from birth. Jesus' disciples asked, "Rabbi, who sinned so that he was born blind, this man or his parents?" Jesus answered, Neither he nor his parents. This happened so that God's mighty works may be displayed in him. During that time, everyone who was reading this or witnessing the story and reading this story or hearing about this story again, they were all familiar with the story of Exodus and how the sins of the father led to the punishment of future generations. But here, Jesus separates the sin from the impairment. Why? So that God's mighty works might be displayed in him, thus breaking the cycle of generational punishment. My hope and work as a Christian and a therapist is to help find breakthroughs in Jesus' good news so that God's mighty work might be displayed in us. So how do we seek healing from our generational trauma? Sometimes it's as easy as declaring that we're made new through Jesus and that we are free from the past. Oftentimes, I find that it's not that easy and we have a longer journey of healing. I think God is abounding in grace for us who are on that longer journey. I want to share what part of that journey can look like for us. The next slide. I just want to say, dealing with generational trauma is really complex, and it's a very slow process. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time together for an in-depth response. But there are two applications that I want to encourage you all to pursue. The first is to get to know your story. One way I recommend doing this is what us therapists call a genogram, building a genogram. A genogram is very much like a family tree. Typically, we go back up to our grandparents, so 3 generations. But it emphasizes different events, relationship dynamics, and behaviors, and how they all play out in your family tree. I have a QR code here with a YouTube link that leads to a tutorial on how to build a genogram. It's really thorough, and I love it because it shows you how to build a genogram and like potential like scenarios of what patterns or relationship dynamics you might witness in your own family. And once we build our genogram, I encourage you to ask these questions. First, what types of patterns do you see in your family history? For example, there could be divorce, pattern of immigration, it could be a pattern of conflict, or a pattern of unexplained death. Another question you would ask is, what of your past has shaped the way you operate in the world today? One thing could be, are you skeptical of others because your mother was? Or do you avoid living near the ocean because of a traumatic event that happened with your aunt? Another question I'd encourage you to ask is, what have you grown to believe because of past experiences of your relatives? Maybe your family has a history of racism or a history of bias. And then finally, what more can you find out from your living relatives? What traumatic experiences do your living relatives remember that you may not? Maybe there are missing family members. What are their stories? Maybe there are untold marriages. It might explain some relational issues you may have. And after you examine your genogram and answer some of these questions, I encourage you to tell your story on the next slide. The hard word is that secrets and keeping things hidden can often cause major damage. For instance, in Mark Wolyn's book, he writes about a client that he had. A client came in, he didn't have any trouble sleeping all up until the day after he turned 19 years old. He woke up one night suddenly and he was freezing, shivering, and he had this sudden fear that if he fell back asleep, that he would never wake up again. When he would start to fall asleep, he would jolt awake, and this became a nightly occurrence, and he'd started to suffer from insomnia. It turns out that when his uncle was 19, his uncle had gotten lost and froze to death. The catch is that this client never knew he had an uncle, because his family experienced such a tragic situation that they decided to just keep it a secret and never said his name again. It was the family's secret that took a toll on the client's mental health and well-being. But when the client made the connection, he was able to explain his fear and begin his journey of healing. Some of you out there might have a traumatic experience that you have kept secret in the family. But in order to find healing or help the healing of others around you, you may want to consider sharing it. And just a couple notes about this is, I just want to say, just proceed with high caution. I know these stories, these experiences are precious. They're not just to be thrown around. And we might have lived our whole lives holding them. Timing is everything. You may not be prepared to share it, or the people that are around you might not be prepared to hear it. And one thing, what I love about the way that God made us is that our brains have this awesome ability to block memories. Sometimes in traumatic experiences, we completely block out our memory just so we could survive and get to the next moment. I think my invitation is to consider, are you in a survival situation now, or are you in a safer place to be able to share your story? I also want to encourage you, tell your story only if you're in a safe place to do so. Maybe with a trusted loved one or the therapist, things like that. And then finally, telling your story is only part of the journey. It's what gives us insight into our past so that we could choose a different future. The last thought and observation that I want to give is that this next slide, I've only been a therapist for a year, but like Tim said, I've worked with youth ministry and on college campus ministry for over 15 years. And there's this one scene in this movie that sums up my understanding of what this generation is going through regarding generational trauma. It comes from the DC movie Blue Beetle. Has anyone seen it? I know it's not everyone's favorite. I thought it was a lot of fun. But there's a scene where the hero's family, spoilers, there's a scene where the hero's family experiences a tragic loss. The family members were dejected and they just wanted to give up. But the grandmother, who is the matriarch of the family, gathers them and says, "There will be a time to cry. This is not that time." See, the grandmother knew that there were difficult times ahead and they needed to just survive. So they suppressed their tears and their sadness. Towards the end, the family and the hero beats the bad guy. The grandmother looks at her family all torn and tired and said, "Now we can cry." I truly believe that this generation is the generation that's not forced to hold back their tears. That this generation is crying the tears that were long overdue, suppressed by the generations before them. And as a result, they're doing the hard work of breaking many cycles of generational trauma so that God's mighty work may be displayed in them. Thank you. I'd like to take some questions.
Yes, let's thank Michael for his presentation. We're entertaining these questions right now. He was able to kind of give us, a foundation that we could all have some common language, but I'm sure there's a lot of questions that we have. We can't have hour-long sessions with Michael right now, but I'm sure there's certain things that may have came up for us. And so let's just have any questions for Michael, and we'll use the next few minutes to do so. So, yeah.
Yes.
Does alcoholism kind of fall into the pattern?
Yes. Yeah. What was your name?
And
thank you for the question. I had a client who, he's a third generation, him not particularly, but his great-grandfather was an alcoholic, or his grandfather was an alcoholic. And then because the reason why he went to alcoholism was, again, he didn't have the tools to deal with the emotions that he had or the stress that he had in life. And that passed down to his father, this client's father, and then again to the client's brother, who was a military vet. So when he came home and saw that he wasn't getting the support that he wanted or needed, he went to alcoholism too, and sadly his brother had passed away. And yes, so very much alcoholism is a traumatic experience that has passed down generationally.
What are some of the tools you use or recommend for managing like emotions or working through those sort of issues?
Yeah, Johar, thanks for Johar's your name, right?
Yeah, you got it.
Thank you for the question.
Good memory.
I think one of the things that I like to share with my clients in terms of managing emotions is to be able to understand them. So oftentimes we're feeling these things, but our brain works really fast, so fast that we don't notice it. So oftentimes we're just reacting to people. We're reacting to what people say or what people do. We never take the time to think about what we're actually feeling. But when we understand what we're feeling, we're able to kind of like process it and say, geez, I'm mad, but why am I mad? It's actually, I'm really sad or embarrassed. And so what do I do with that? What do I do with that sadness? And you could share that maybe with people that you trust and care for, so that that part of you who is sad can be seen and understood. And you can process it and kind of grow stronger and kind of be able to hold that sadness. A lot of the reasons why we can't control our emotions is we feel too uncomfortable to hold the emotions that we have. So the practice is to be able to hold the emotions, sit in the sadness. It's really uncomfortable, but to sit in it and learn how to sit in it, and that'll strengthen you to carry on in life.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I guess one question I was curious about is, from your experience working with young folks, so young adults, college people, what would you say, because now it seems like mental health and all these things are coming to the forefront, are coming to the surface. What would you say is kind of the trends that you see among young folks, and hopefully something that gives us a sense of hope?
Yeah, so very much like how I kind of ended what I shared. I hear a lot of my younger clients, and even in my ministry experience, they share like, oh, my parents always say like, I'm just too sad, or I need to get outside, which very valid things, exercise, getting good rest. Those are all foundational things to just keep going. But like I was sharing before, is that I think this generation actually is in kind of this place of safety and ability to kind of process all these things, so it doesn't continue, kind of trauma doesn't continue. Now, this is not to reflect poorly on our parents or our grandparents or anything like that, but they did what they did to get through. But then what I'm excited about is this generation is they're wanting to do better. So I think that's what's so beautiful.
Any last questions?
Do you recommend any literature or book to read? I mean, you talk about someone being able to sit with their emotions, but sometimes someone will sit with their emotions but don't know how to handle their emotions. So how do you deal with that? Or because I work with teens and I talk to families all the time, and I see some of these kids. I go, how are these kids going to heal in terms of what they're dealing with? Because they come to I work at a residential center. They come to our residential center, but then you have parents who have their own issues that aren't taken care of, and then they learn those behaviors from their parents. And that's where the generational trauma. So how do we stop that? Just like if you're an alcoholic, how do we stop today those behaviors?
Yeah. Thank you for asking the question. What was your name?
I'm Howard.
Howard, nice to meet you.
I'm Tim's uncle.
Oh, is that right?
So, also.
Wonderful. So that's a wonderful question. So as it relates to generational trauma, I highly recommend the book, Mark Wolyn's book, It Didn't Start With You. That it's just a wonderful example of just explaining generational trauma and then very practical steps on how to carry that and how to process that. But more directly to your question about the youth, a lot of what I find is a lot of younger folk are just not being heard. And so the things that they're experiencing are not validated. Unfortunately, their parents, it's just difficult in terms of finances, and we just can't give, a lot of parents just can't give the attention that the children need, per se, to be able to be well adjusted, because they're just working their butt off to survive, right?
Or the parents don't have the skills.
Exactly. Yeah. And so there isn't necessarily like high level of training. There isn't like any tricks per se, as opposed to being able to hear their kid and being able to validate what's happening. Like, not to necessarily offer a fix, because oftentimes we just want the emotion to go away, but rather to be able to hear it out and say, oh, you're feeling passionate about this, or you're feeling sad about that. Tell me more about why you're feeling sad about that. That helps them realize, oh, it's okay to have these emotions, and I don't have to just shut up or move quickly through them. Yeah. Hopefully that was helpful.
Do you work with other? Do you practice other therapies like music therapy or art therapy or?
Not per se as a framework. I don't necessarily use that type of therapy as a framework, but there are specific exercises and interventions that I do use depending on what is helpful for treatment. So a lot of times with, say for instance, people who are under, in the adolescent age, often use art to kind of help them, draw out their house and the family members of their house and what that means for them, or have them kind of just free draw, kind of free association, and talk about what was on their minds to kind of just help them process and bring out kind of the deeper things. But, yeah.
I have a question about cortisol.
Yes, go ahead.
How does that affect brain chemistry in the long term?
Cortisol in the long term? Yeah, so the studies are really cutting edge right now, because before the understanding was high levels of cortisol actually led to stress and anxiety. But actually what is being learned now is that the high level of cortisol is what's helping trying to bring down the stress and anxiety, because cortisol secreted in the brain kind of releases the signals for a certain type of sugar to be released there. That sugar is a critical part of the brain process to bring down stress and anxiety. But a prolonged exposure to stressful experiences has leads to high cortisol levels, but eventually it just drops. Your brain just lowers it completely, and it doesn't respond that way. There's kind of like a dissociation or a deadening in the brain because the trauma is too much. So then what happens is, especially for pregnant women, that gets passed down. It's interesting to think that pregnant women hold 3 generations in one go. The pregnant woman, the potential, say, daughter, and then the eggs that are produced in that daughter. It's 3 generations all there. So there's a study called epigenetics. You might want to look into it, about kind of those genetic markers that can be turned on and off, and how that is
Does alcoholism have the same, and drug addictions, do they have the same effects on cortisol, or are they different chemicals in the brain?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, but there are different hormones that also help with mood. So I can't say for sure cortisol, but I can get back to you with that. What was your name?
Joanne.
Joanne, thank you so much. Yeah, I think that's time.
Yeah. Well, just a couple more questions that I have.
Oh, yeah.
Michael, at this time, are you taking new clients?
I am taking clients. I'll be graduating in June, and then I'm opening up another evening of office time. So yeah, I'll leave my card here if you're interested, and maybe we could set something up together.
So he is local also to Orange County. So for those of you who might be looking for that or have someone you'd recommend, also for those who are online, Michael Jacobe. So let's give a hand for Michael. Thanks so much for sharing this topic. I think it was very informative. And
Tim, by the way, this is the first one who says, yes, I am. The others are like, yes.
let's just say that there is a high demand and not enough supply right now, which is a good reason why there are more folks like Michael who are getting their education, getting their licensing, because God literally knows that we need more professionals in the field of mental health. So just to close us, a couple of announcements. First, on Sunday at 11:15 a.m., we're going to be celebrating Palm Sunday, and they're going to have a special guest speaker. Me. So if you want to come and hear me speak more, I'll be here. I'll also be here on Friday. So, which gives us another announcement, which is next week, it's not just any Friday. You know what Friday it is? It's a Good Friday, even though there's some stuff that's also pretty intense that happens. So we'll be meeting here at 6:30 for Good Friday. And it's going to be a joint effort between Tim and Alfredo. We call it Tim Fredo. So you might want to come out to that as well. And we also want to announce that our next mental health seminar will not be on the fourth Friday of April, but rather it's going to be in a few weeks. So April 12th, we're having my therapist from a while back. Her name is Karen Allen. She's going to be coming, and she's going to be speaking on the topic of unveiling shadows, addressing suicide, and its mental health precursors. So I'm glad, one, that we're going to be talking about a subject like this, but two, that we're getting someone who is very experienced in being able to talk about this, dispel the myths, and just help us being able to engage a topic that I think, it is very intense, it is very traumatic, but we do want to be able to engage it and be able to also help people before things get too bad. And so with that, I'm going to close this for this night. But in the back, we have some refreshments and snacks, so please feel free to enjoy fellowship. If you have any other questions that you may want to have asked Michael, but it may not have been appropriate to share kind of with the large group, he's going to be around as well. And also in the back, there's a donation box that if you enjoy what you're seeing here, please help contribute to make sure that we can have stuff like this go on. But let me just pray for us as we close. I'll pray a blessing that may be very familiar from us that we sang earlier. But Lord, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you. The Lord be gracious to you and give you peace. We lift this up in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Next week is a